Some heroes carry their stories on their sleeves. Others carry them in silence. And sometimes, the story everyone wants to know begins with a single question no one should have asked. The wind moved gently across the waterfront in Halifax, Nova Scotia, carrying the scent of salt water and distant pine through the crisp autumn air. The sky hung low beneath a blanket of silver clouds, and along the harbor, dozens of people gathered for the annual Community Safety Appreciation Day. Families wandered between information booths. Local officers greeted residents. Patrol vehicles gleamed beneath the soft afternoon light. Children pointed excitedly at flashing emergency lights while seniors stopped to shake hands with officers they had known for years. Near the center of the event stood Constable Ethan Sinclair. At 42 years old, Ethan carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent most of his life serving others. His dark navy uniform was pressed neatly. A few strands of gray had begun to appear near his temples, though they only seemed to add to the calm steadiness in his face. Beside him sat Atlas. The German shepherd remained perfectly still despite the activity surrounding him. His sable coat caught hints of gold whenever sunlight slipped through the clouds. His ears stood alert. His amber eyes moved carefully from face to face, observing everything. Most people who saw Atlas immediately smiled. Some asked to take photographs. Others simply admired him from a respectful distance. Yet on this particular afternoon, something else kept drawing attention. It was the harness. Thick, black, and professionally fitted, it wrapped around Atlas's body differently than standard service equipment. Several visitors glanced at it. Then glanced again. A few whispered among themselves. Ethan noticed every look. Atlas noticed them too. The dog remained calm, though his gaze occasionally drifted toward the harbor beyond the crowd, as if searching for something only he could see. A television crew arrived shortly after 2 o'clock. Their camera moved through the gathering, capturing smiling faces and community displays. Eventually they stopped near Ethan and Atlas. The young reporter seemed friendly enough. She introduced herself, exchanged a few polite words, then crouched slightly to get a better look at Atlas. The camera lens followed. For a moment, all attention settled on the dog. Atlas did not move. The reporter smiled. "Beautiful canine," she said. Ethan nodded. "He's a good partner." The reporter's eyes shifted toward the harness. Her smile remained, though curiosity crept into her voice. "If you don't mind me asking, what's wrong with him?" The question landed softly. Yet something about it changed the air around them. Ethan's expression froze. Atlas slowly lifted his head. The harbor sound seemed farther away now. The laughter. The conversations. The music playing from nearby speakers. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. The reporter immediately looked uncomfortable. She had not meant any harm. To her, it was simply a question. To Ethan, it was something else entirely. He looked down at Atlas. The old German shepherd returned the gaze without hesitation. There was trust there. Years of it. The kind built one day at a time. The kind that survives storms most people never see. Ethan reached down and rested a hand gently against the side of the harness. His fingers lingered there for a moment. Then he finally spoke. Quietly. Carefully. "There's nothing wrong with him." The reporter blinked. Ethan looked back toward the camera. A faint sadness touched his eyes before disappearing again. "That harness isn't there because he's weak." He paused. Around them, a few nearby people had stopped talking. Even the camera operator seemed unusually still. Ethan swallowed once and glanced at Atlas. The dog never looked away. "He earned that harness," Ethan said. No one understood what he meant. Not yet. But hidden behind those simple words was a story that began years earlier on a cold Canadian night, a story very few people knew, and one that neither Ethan nor Atlas had ever truly left behind. Most people assumed Atlas tolerated the harness because he had no choice. The truth was stranger. Atlas hated anyone touching it. Over the years, dozens of officers had learned that lesson. Not through aggression. Not through disobedience. The German shepherd was too disciplined for that. But whenever unfamiliar hands reached toward the straps, Atlas would quietly step away. Sometimes he would turn his body. Sometimes he would simply walk to Ethan's side and sit there, watching. Waiting. It was one of the few things he never allowed. Even now, standing among the crowds beside the Halifax waterfront, Atlas shifted closer to Ethan as people continued moving through the event. The afternoon light softened as clouds drifted in from the Atlantic. A cool breeze rippled across the harbor, stirring flags and carrying the distant cries of gulls overhead. Ethan remained polite as more visitors approached, but his thoughts were no longer in the present. The reporter's question had opened a door he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Atlas seemed to sense it immediately. He always did. The dog slowly leaned his shoulder against Ethan's leg. It was a small gesture, one most people would never notice. Yet it was the same gesture Atlas had used for years whenever Ethan's mind wandered someplace difficult. A silent reminder. I am here. A young constable named Liam Mercer approached from across the event grounds carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He had joined the service less than a year earlier and still carried the enthusiasm of someone who believed every mystery deserved an answer. He handed 1 cup to Ethan and smiled at Atlas. Still guarding the old secret, he asked. Ethan gave a faint laugh. Something like that. Liam crouched beside the dog. Atlas allowed him close. The younger officer had earned the trust over time. Even so, when Liam's eyes drifted toward the harness, Atlas immediately lowered his gaze toward the straps. Protective. Watchful. Liam noticed it. See. He does that every time. Ethan nodded. Because it matters to him. It is just equipment, though. Right? Liam asked. Ethan stared out toward the water. Small fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. Their reflections shimmered across the gray-blue surface of the harbor. For several seconds, he did not answer. Finally, he said quietly, not to Atlas. Liam studied the harness again. It certainly looked ordinary from a distance. Black nylon. Reinforced stitching. Metal buckles worn smooth from years of use. Yet there were signs of age no replacement could imitate. Tiny scratches. Faded sections where paws and weather had left their mark. The harness looked less like equipment and more like something carried through a lifetime. You ever think about replacing it? Liam asked. Ethan's expression softened. A few years ago, I tried. Liam smiled. And Ethan looked down at Atlas. The dog met his eyes for a brief moment before turning toward the harbor again. He would not wear the new one. Liam laughed softly. Seriously. 3 different harnesses, Ethan said. 3 different manufacturers. Same result every time. So what happened? Ethan rubbed Atlas gently behind one ear. Eventually I stopped trying. Liam shook his head in disbelief. Around them, people continued enjoying the event. The sounds of conversation drifted through the air. Yet for Ethan, the memory felt much closer than the crowd. Because the truth was that Atlas had not rejected those replacements out of stubbornness. Deep down, Ethan had always suspected the dog remembered exactly what that old harness represented. Not the fabric. Not the buckles. Something far more important. Something tied to a cold night years earlier when both of their lives changed forever. And somewhere within that memory lay the reason Atlas never let it go. By late afternoon, the crowds along the Halifax waterfront began to thin. The sunlight faded behind layers of cloud drifting inland from the Atlantic, turning the harbor silver and pale blue. Folding tables were packed away. Patrol vehicles slowly departed. Volunteers carried boxes toward waiting trucks. Yet long after most visitors had gone home, the question still lingered in Ethan Sinclair's mind. Not because he was offended by it. People saw the harness and naturally became curious. What stayed with him was how little anyone truly knew about the dog sitting beside him. Atlas had become something of a local legend over the years. Residents recognized him from community events, school visits, and charity fundraisers. They knew he was calm. They knew he was friendly. They knew he had served with distinction. But very few understood the years that came before. The sacrifices hidden beneath the quiet routine of daily life. Atlas stretched slowly beside the patrol vehicle as Ethan loaded equipment into the rear compartment. The German Shepherd moved carefully but with confidence. His muzzle had grown lighter with age. Fine strands of silver now mixed with the darker fur around his face. Yet his eyes remained unchanged. Alert. Intelligent. Watching everything. Ethan smiled faintly. Long day, partner. Atlas responded with a soft huff and settled onto the pavement beside him. A few meters away, Liam was helping another officer dismantle a display tent. Every few moments the younger constable glanced toward Atlas as though still trying to solve a puzzle. Eventually he walked over carrying a folded chair beneath one arm. You know, Liam said, setting the chair down, everyone talks about Atlas like he has always been this perfect dog. Ethan laughed quietly. Trust me. He had opinions from day one. Liam smiled. How old was he when you got him? Ethan paused. The memory arrived instantly. Not because he thought about it often. Because some moments never truly leave. 14 months, he said. Still young. Full of energy. Thought he owned the world. Atlas lifted one ear at the sound of Ethan's voice. Liam crouched nearby. What was he like? Ethan looked toward the harbor. The evening air carried the scent of seawater and cedar. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the bay. Honestly, he said. At first, I was not sure we would work together. Liam looked surprised. Ethan smiled. Atlas was brilliant. Everybody knew it. But he did not trust easily. The German Shepherd remained still beside them, though his tail gave a single slow movement. Ethan remembered those early days clearly now. Long training sessions before sunrise. Endless kilometers across wooded trails outside the city. Rain. Snow. Wind coming off the Atlantic. Some mornings they barely spoke because there was nothing to say. Trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. Day after day. One small step at a time. There had been failures. Missed signals. Frustrating exercises. Moments when both men and dog seemed to test each other's patience. Yet something deeper slowly formed beneath the routine. Not obedience. Partnership. Atlas learned Ethan's voice. Ethan learned Atlas's instincts. Before long, they no longer needed many commands at all. A glance often said enough. Liam listened carefully. Sounds like he changed your life. Ethan looked down at Atlas. The dog met his gaze for only a second before looking away again. Almost modestly. No, Ethan said quietly. Not back then. The evening breeze strengthened slightly. Dark clouds gathered farther offshore. Ethan rested his hand against the old harness. His expression changed. The warmth faded. Something heavier appeared behind his eyes. Back then, he said softly, I thought I was the one teaching him. He fell silent for a moment. Atlas remained motionless beneath his hand. I had no idea that one day he would be the one carrying me through the hardest night of my life. The memory always began with the weather. Ethan could never think about that night without first remembering the cold. It had been late November, years before the community event on the Halifax waterfront. Winter had not fully arrived, but Nova Scotia was already preparing for it. A damp wind swept inland from the Atlantic, carrying the scent of salt and rain through the dark forests beyond the city limits. The roads glistened beneath intermittent showers. Bare branches scraped against one another above narrow rural highways. It was the kind of evening when most people preferred to stay indoors with the lights on and the curtains drawn. Ethan and Atlas were nearing the end of a long shift when the radio crackled to life. A report had come in from a remote industrial area nearly 40 kilometers outside Halifax. Security staff at a closed warehouse complex had noticed unusual activity after hours. Nothing dramatic. No alarms. No emergency. Just enough uncertainty to justify a patrol response. Ethan acknowledged the call and steered the vehicle toward the outskirts of the city. Atlas immediately lifted his head from the rear compartment. The German Shepherd always seemed to know when routine was about to become something else. Streetlights gradually disappeared as they traveled farther from town. The highway narrowed. Forest replaced neighborhoods. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Ethan glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Nearly 10:30. It should have been an ordinary assignment. A quick check. A brief report. Then home. Yet something felt different. He could not explain why. Years of policing had taught him to trust certain instincts. Atlas had taught him that lesson too. The warehouse complex appeared through the darkness shortly before 11. Several aging buildings sat behind a chain-link fence near the edge of a wooded property. Most of the structures had been vacant for years. Their windows reflected only fragments of light from distant security lamps. The place felt forgotten. Silent. The kind of location people passed without a second glance. Ethan parked near the main gate and stepped outside. Cold air immediately wrapped around him. Somewhere beyond the buildings, wind rattled loose metal panels. Rainwater dripped steadily from rooftops. Atlas jumped down beside him, landing lightly despite the wet pavement. His ears stood alert. His posture changed almost instantly. Ethan noticed it right away. The dog was focused. Not anxious. Not aggressive. Focused. They moved through the property together. Flashlight beams swept across loading docks, storage containers, and rows of weathered equipment. Nothing appeared unusual. No movement. No voices. No obvious signs of trouble. Yet Atlas continued scanning. His nose worked constantly. Every few meters he paused to test the air before moving forward again. Ethan trusted that behavior. Atlas had ignored countless distractions throughout his career. If something held his attention, there was usually a reason. They approached one of the larger warehouse buildings near the back of the property. Its steel walls rose from the darkness like a shadow against the cloudy sky. Several exterior lights had burned out long ago, leaving much of the area in darkness. Atlas slowed. His body stiffened slightly. Ethan stopped walking. The German Shepherd stared toward the building's side entrance. Rain pattered quietly across the pavement between them. Neither moved. Seconds passed. Then Atlas did something he rarely did. He stepped directly in front of Ethan and blocked his path. Ethan frowned. "What is it, partner?" Atlas never looked away from the building. The wind shifted. A distant metallic sound echoed somewhere inside the structure. Faint. Brief. Easy to dismiss. Yet Atlas remained perfectly still. Every muscle in his body seemed to tighten with purpose. Ethan felt a chill unrelated to the weather. Because in all the years they had worked together, Atlas had only reacted like that a handful of times. And every single time, he had been right. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Atlas moved. Rain drifted through the glow of the flashlight, turning the air into a curtain of silver threads. The warehouse stood silent ahead of them. Cold. Empty-looking. Yet Atlas remained planted firmly in Ethan's path. His ears were forward. His breathing was steady. Every instinct in his trained body seemed focused on the darkness beyond the side entrance. Ethan had learned years earlier that hesitation from Atlas meant something. The dog never reacted without reason. Slowly, Ethan keyed his radio. He reported their location and requested that another unit remain available if needed. The dispatcher acknowledged the message. The familiar voice over the radio sounded reassuring against the lonely backdrop of wind and rain. Ethan clipped the radio back into place and studied the building once more. Nothing appeared unusual. No broken windows. No vehicles. No movement. Yet Atlas refused to advance. The German Shepherd took 2 careful steps forward, then stopped again. His nose lifted toward the damp air. Ethan followed. Together they approached the side entrance. The metal door stood slightly ajar. Not wide enough to notice from a distance, but enough to catch attention once they were close. A narrow gap separated the door from the frame. Wind occasionally pushed it open another centimeter before letting it drift back. Ethan frowned. According to property records, the facility had been closed for years. No one should have been inside. Atlas lowered his head and examined the threshold. Water pooled along the concrete. Faint marks crossed the surface. Recent movement perhaps. Difficult to tell in the rain. Ethan switched off his flashlight for a moment and listened. The darkness seemed to deepen instantly. Somewhere inside the building came a faint metallic creak. Then silence. Then another sound. Soft. Brief. Almost impossible to identify. Atlas heard it too. The dog's posture tightened. Ethan felt a familiar sensation settle into his chest. Not fear. Awareness. The understanding that something was waiting beyond what he could see. He opened the door carefully and stepped inside. The warehouse smelled of dust, damp concrete, and old machinery. Massive support beams disappeared into darkness overhead. Rows of abandoned equipment sat beneath protective tarps that had long ago collected layers of grime. Rain tapped gently against the distant roof. Their footsteps echoed across the vast interior. Atlas moved ahead several meters, scanning continuously. Ethan's flashlight swept across walls, storage racks, and empty workstations. Everything appeared undisturbed. Yet the uneasy feeling remained. Then Atlas stopped. Completely. His head turned toward the far end of the warehouse. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's gaze. There, partially hidden behind a cluster of old industrial equipment, stood a section of temporary shelving. Nothing seemed remarkable about it. At least not at first. Then Ethan noticed something unusual. One of the shelves appeared slightly out of place. Only a few centimeters. Barely enough to catch attention. Atlas stared at it without blinking. The German Shepherd let out a low sound deep in his throat. Not a growl. A warning. Ethan approached cautiously. The closer he came, the more obvious the irregularity became. The shelving unit was not positioned naturally. It looked as though someone had moved it recently. He paused several meters away. Atlas suddenly stepped in front of him again. Faster this time. More urgently. Ethan stopped immediately. The dog had never behaved this way without cause. Silence filled the enormous building. Rain tapped softly overhead. Somewhere in the darkness a single drop of water struck concrete. Then another. Ethan looked at Atlas. Atlas looked toward the shelving. Neither knew it yet, but the next few seconds would change both of their lives forever. Atlas moved first. Not toward the shelving unit, but directly across Ethan's path. The motion was so sudden and deliberate that Ethan instinctively stopped. Years of working together had created reactions faster than thought. Trust had become habit. The German Shepherd planted himself between Ethan and the suspicious structure, his eyes fixed forward. Then came a sound. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the warehouse. It lasted less than a second. Ethan barely had time to register it. A section of equipment near the shelving shifted unexpectedly. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just enough to send several unsecured industrial components sliding from an elevated position. The movement triggered a chain reaction of noise that rolled through the darkness like distant thunder. Atlas lunged. Not away from the danger. Toward Ethan. The force of the impact drove Ethan backward several steps. His shoulder struck the concrete floor. The flashlight skidded away, sending a beam of light spinning wildly across the warehouse ceiling. For a moment, confusion replaced everything else. Dust drifted through the air. Metal clattered somewhere nearby. Then silence returned almost as quickly as it had vanished. Ethan pushed himself upright. His pulse hammered in his ears. The warehouse stood still once more. Rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, water dripped steadily onto concrete. The event had lasted only seconds. Yet something felt wrong. Ethan turned immediately toward Atlas. The German Shepherd was standing several meters away. But not quite normally. His breathing had changed. His posture looked strained. One front paw remained slightly lifted from the floor. Ethan's stomach tightened. Atlas. The dog looked at him immediately. His tail moved once. Just once. As if reassuring Ethan before anything else. Ethan crossed the distance quickly and knelt beside him. The flashlight beam now rested against a support column, casting long shadows through the building. In the uneven light, Ethan could finally see what had happened. During the confusion, Atlas had positioned himself directly between Ethan and the area where the equipment had shifted. The dog had reacted before there had been time to think. Before there had been time to evaluate. Before there had been time to choose. He had simply done what he always did. Protect his partner. Ethan carefully examined him. Atlas remained calm despite obvious discomfort. There was no panic in his eyes. No fear. Only concern. Concern for Ethan. Even now. Ethan swallowed hard. You stubborn old hero, he whispered. Atlas responded with a soft huff. The familiar sound nearly broke him. Backup units arrived several minutes later after Ethan updated dispatch. A safety inspection of the area revealed unstable industrial materials that had been improperly secured years earlier and partially shifted over time. The situation could have become significantly more dangerous if approached differently. The officers on scene spoke professionally. Reports were filed. Procedures were followed. Yet Ethan barely heard any of it. His attention never left Atlas. By the time they returned to the vehicle, the rain had become steadier. Water streamed across the windshield beneath the parking lot lights. Atlas climbed into the rear compartment more slowly than usual. Ethan noticed immediately. Every small movement felt heavier now. More careful. The drive back toward Halifax was quiet. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. Wind pushed against the vehicle from the open Atlantic. Atlas rested behind him without making a sound. Several times Ethan glanced into the rearview mirror. Each time the German Shepherd was watching him. Calm. Faithful. Present. As though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But deep inside, Ethan already knew the truth. Something important had changed that night. And the real cost of Atlas's choice had only just begun to reveal itself. The following weeks unfolded more slowly than Ethan would have believed possible. Winter settled across Nova Scotia with quiet determination. Frost painted the edges of windows each morning. Harbor winds carried a sharper bite. Snow occasionally drifted across the city before melting into cold rain by afternoon. Through it all, Atlas faced a challenge unlike any he had encountered during his years of service. At first, the signs were subtle. A hesitation before jumping into the patrol vehicle. A slight stiffness after long shifts. A careful adjustment whenever he rose from the floor. Most people would not have noticed. Ethan noticed every detail. He had spent too many years beside the dog not to. Veterinary specialists examined Atlas repeatedly. The diagnosis brought relief and heartbreak at the same time. The injury was manageable. Treatable. But recovery would be long. There would be limitations. Adjustments. New routines. Atlas listened to none of those conversations. He cared only about one thing. Returning to work beside Ethan. The rehabilitation center sat on the outskirts of Halifax near a wooded area overlooking a frozen inlet. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan drove there. Some days snowflakes drifted through the darkness. Other mornings thick fog rolled inland from the Atlantic. Atlas never complained. Never resisted. He approached each session with the same determination he once brought to training exercises. The therapists quickly grew fond of him. They admired his patience. His intelligence. His refusal to quit. Yet there were difficult days. Days when progress seemed invisible. Days when simple exercises demanded enormous effort. Ethan remained beside him through all of them. Sometimes he spoke softly. Sometimes he simply sat nearby while Atlas worked through another challenge. Neither needed many words. Their partnership had long ago moved beyond conversation. One afternoon, nearly 3 months into recovery, a specialist introduced a custom support harness designed to reduce strain and improve stability during movement. The black straps looked practical rather than remarkable. No one expected it to become important. Atlas certainly did not seem impressed. At first he refused to move. The therapists exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan knelt beside him. "Come on, partner," he said quietly. Atlas studied him for a moment. Then slowly rose to his feet. One careful step followed another. The movement was awkward. Unfamiliar. Yet something changed. For the first time in weeks, his gait appeared more comfortable. More natural. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Progress had finally arrived. Over the following months the harness became part of daily life. Atlas wore it during rehabilitation sessions. Then during walks. Then during longer outings around the city. Little by little, strength returned. Confidence followed. The first time Atlas completed a full kilometer along the waterfront trail without stopping, Ethan nearly laughed out loud. The dog looked proud of himself too. Though he would never admit it. By spring, Atlas had accomplished something many people thought unlikely. He returned to service in a limited capacity. Not because anyone demanded it. Because he insisted. The harness remained. It supported him physically, yes. But somewhere along the way it became something more. A symbol neither man nor dog fully discussed. A reminder of perseverance. Of loyalty. Of a difficult season survived together. Whenever Ethan reached for the harness before a shift, Atlas stood perfectly still. Patient. Trusting. Almost protective of it. As though he understood that those worn straps represented far more than recovery. They represented a promise. And every day that promise remained unbroken. The harbor lights reflected across the dark water as evening settled over. Halifax once again. The community event had officially ended hours earlier, yet Ethan remained near the waterfront parking area long after the last display tent had disappeared. Atlas rested beside the patrol vehicle, his familiar harness catching faint traces of light from nearby street lamps. The air smelled of salt, cedar, and approaching rain. Across the harbor, ferry lights moved slowly through the darkness like floating lanterns. Liam had gone home. Most of the officers had gone home. Yet Ethan stayed. Some memories were easier to revisit in silence. Atlas lifted his head and watched him. The German shepherd always seemed to know when the past was nearby. Earlier that afternoon, the reporter's simple question had reopened a story Ethan rarely shared. Not because he wanted to hide it. Because some things felt too important to explain casually. Over the years, countless people had noticed the harness. They assumed it existed because Atlas needed support. Technically, they were correct. But the harness represented far more than assistance. It represented choice. Loyalty. Sacrifice. Things harder to measure than physical recovery. Ethan reached into the patrol vehicle and retrieved a small framed photograph he kept tucked inside a storage compartment. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing beside Atlas shortly after the dog's return to active duty. Both looked proud. Both looked relieved. The harness appeared clearly in the image. New. Untouched by time. Ethan studied the photograph quietly. "You remember this day?" he asked softly. Atlas's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. The dog slowly rose and walked closer. Ethan smiled. "Of course you do." A few drops of rain began falling onto the pavement. Small circles appeared across puddles near the curb. Ethan looked out toward the harbor. During recovery, there had been moments when retirement seemed inevitable. Specialists had prepared him for that possibility. Friends had gently suggested it. Even fellow officers had quietly accepted it. Everyone except Atlas. The dog never behaved like his career was ending. Every morning he approached rehabilitation as though preparing for another shift. Every obstacle became another task to complete. Every setback became temporary. Looking back, Ethan realized something important. Atlas had never fought to return because he loved the job. He fought because he loved the partnership. Service was simply where that partnership lived. A pair of pedestrians passed along the waterfront trail and noticed Atlas sitting beneath the streetlight. One of them smiled. "Beautiful dog," the men called out. Ethan nodded politely. "He really is." The strangers continued walking, unaware of the story resting only a few meters away. Unaware that the quiet German shepherd beside the vehicle had changed a life. Unaware that an ordinary-looking harness carried the weight of years, sacrifice, and devotion. Ethan watched them disappear into the darkness. Then he looked back at Atlas. The dog sat patiently beneath the falling rain, calm as ever. The harness rested against his shoulders exactly where it always had. Most people saw equipment. Some saw recovery. Ethan saw something different. He saw the night a loyal partner stepped forward without hesitation. He saw months of perseverance. He saw a promise kept. And for the first time that day, he understood why Atlas never accepted a replacement. Because the harness was never simply something he wore. It had become part of the story they carried together. Several days after the community event, a small ceremony was held inside police headquarters overlooking the harbor. It was not a grand occasion. No television cameras. No reporters. Just officers, staff members, and a handful of people who had worked alongside Ethan and Atlas over the years. Outside, late autumn rain drifted across the city. Inside, warm light reflected from polished floors and framed photographs that lined the walls. Atlas sat quietly near the front of the room wearing the same harness he had worn for years. He looked older now. The silver around his muzzle was impossible to miss. Yet there was still something noble in the way he carried himself. Something steady. Something unshaken by time. Ethan stood nearby holding a small plaque that the department had prepared in recognition of Atlas's service. When asked to speak, he hesitated at first. Public speaking had never been his strength. But after a moment, he stepped forward. The room grew silent. Atlas watched him from across the floor. Ethan looked at the officers gathered before him and then down at the plaque in his hands. Most people see a police dog, he began quietly. And that is fair. He has been one for most of his life. A few smiles appeared around the room. Ethan glanced toward Atlas. What people do not always see are the mornings before sunrise. The cold days. The difficult days. The years spent earning trust one moment at a time. The room remained completely still. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the harbor. Ethan took a slow breath. A lot of people think loyalty means staying beside someone when things are easy. Atlas taught me something different. He paused. His eyes settled on the old harness resting across the German shepherd's shoulders. Loyalty is staying when things become difficult. Loyalty is continuing when there is no guarantee of success. Loyalty is choosing someone else's well-being before your own comfort. No one spoke. Several officers lowered their eyes. They understood exactly what he meant. Ethan smiled faintly. Years ago, during a night I will never forget, Atlas made a choice. He did not stop to calculate the risk. He did not ask what he might lose. He simply acted. His voice softened. And because of that, I am standing here today. Across the room, Atlas slowly rose and walked toward him. The familiar sound of his paws echoed gently against the floor. Ethan reached down and rested a hand against the harness as the dog sat beside him. The gesture felt natural. Practiced. Like something repeated thousands of times over countless days. People ask about this harness, Ethan said. They think it represents an injury. He shook his head. It represents courage. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Respectful. The kind of silence that appears when words are no longer necessary. Beyond the windows, the clouds began to break apart. A narrow band of sunlight slipped through and scattered across the harbor waters below. Golden reflections danced across the surface. Ethan looked down at Atlas one final time. The German shepherd leaned lightly against his leg exactly as he had done so many times before. The same silent reassurance. The same faithful presence. And in that moment Ethan understood something he wished everyone could know. Heroes are not always the ones who stand in front of a crowd. Sometimes they walk beside us quietly for years. Sometimes they carry scars no one notices. Sometimes they wear old harnesses that tell stories only a few people understand. And sometimes the greatest act of love is simply refusing to leave someone behind.